Amen. We've been revising the course of the last few years as the light began to open up in 2016 that led to the message given in October of 2018. We began with Acts 27 that took us to the history of two ships, Adramyttium and Alexandria. It brought us to the number 273, which linked us to the Pyrrhic War and the history of Pyrrhus. We saw that history of the Pyrrhic War had connections with our own history, with our own war between the North and the South. This was all in the last months of 2016. 2017, it's observed that there's an Alpha and an Omega history, Macedonia and Italy, connecting World War II now into our narrative. This is all still centering around the King of the South. I want to make that point. It's the whole focus, while we're still learning about Hitler and Nazi Germany and world wars, the focus is all coming from the direction of the King of the South. We see these Alpha and Omega histories, World War II and World War III. And then it's observed that these leaders, the kings of Epirus, connect to the history of those kings, line up with the history of the King of the South in our own history. From Admetus through to Pyrrhus, connects with the history of Stalin through to Putin. And we see that Pyrrhus co-rules, Putin co-rules, and there's this history leading up to it with Gorbachev and Yanayev and Yeltsin that corresponds with the history of Epirus that leads up to that king, King Pyrrhus. This makes it much more firm that Stalin is a subject in this narrative and that Pyrrhus represents Putin, or the King of the South. This connection between Putin and Stalin makes it for a much stronger argument that we can cut the line and connect to these histories and lay World War II over World War III. And now we've connected Alpha and Omega, cutting the line and seeing Macedonia, Italy, World War II, World War III, Alpha and Omega, Alpha and Omega. This is all in the history of 2017. Then I attend for the first time the School of the Prophets in Arkansas, and Fatima begins to open up. Fatima opened up November 11 of 2017. By the time of attending that school, in those last months of 2017, it's already recognised that November 9 is a subject in our history. And I attempt to hide my own link to that day, afraid that when the subject was finally taught, it would prove to be a stumbling block. Once this is done, once you've connected these histories and you're overlaying World War II and World War III, we can see that World War II begins in 2016. And if World War II begins in 2016, what does that war look like? By this time, we're well after 2016, and we can see there's no open, hot warfare happening, at least on the Western Front, as regards Donald Trump. But this war that was fought was an info war, an information war. And I begin to study what this war looks like. Again, connecting the elephants. 2016, 18, Raphia, Panium, all having the same mode of warfare, that of elephants. And if this 2016 is typified by battle, which is ipsis, what do battles look like in our history? This causes a study to be developed into the information age. tracing from the time of the end the development of a new mode of warfare. 1989 was the big bang of the information age, the invention of the World Wide Web. And that is a solid study that could be expanded many, many times to show how that thread ties through our reform line, not just from 1989, but in the 10 years before that, and then back to 1969 with the invention of the internet, ARPANET. With this study into the mode of warfare and the information age, I begin to observe that a large part of what we're seeing, how this war is fought, is with conspiracy theories. That it's conspiracy theories that are being used to take down the opposition. And through the study of the elephants, it's identified that those conspiracy theories are what are a characteristic of the way the King of the South fights, the way Russia fights, and also how Donald Trump has fought in that election. So conspiracy theories begin to be a subject connected to this increasing knowledge. And they're traced all through this history, particularly in the 2016 election. When we discussed the information age, I brought up another subject. Elder Jeff recently taught in his latest videos, which is working to attack or to undermine this message, that I am not consistent with methodology. Because he says, 1989, yes, but then there's 1996. And in 1996, Hillary Clinton is being investigated for corruption. She's investigated in 1996, and then she's investigated again in 2016. So you have Clinton in 1996 and Clinton in 2016. She's comes under a subpoena in 96 and she's subpoenaed again in 2016. So he connects those two waymarks and he says Tess is inconsistent with her methodology because she does not bring up this connection Clinton has to 1996. She doesn't connect it to 2016, and really she doesn't see that Clinton is a corrupt, wicked person. They morally, Elder Jeff says, that we say that Clinton is morally good. That in itself is factually incorrect. I've never claimed she's morally good. We're dealing with this prophetically, not morally. But what he then did was start a thread in 1996 and connect it to 2016. It was in the school in Brazil when we began to teach in a much more firm fashion this concept of connecting threads. And we taught, based on lines of evidence, that if you're going to build a story and connect a thread, it begins in 1989. So he's missed a waymark. He's missed a waymark. In fact, he's missed a couple of waymarks because in here you have the increase of knowledge. And then missed 9/11, 2014, and all those other waymarks, 2012. But at least these key waymarks on this reform line are completely dropped. And you know if you drop a stitch, everything starts to unravel. That's not how you sew. So he's connected a thread from 96 to 2016 and say that based on his thinking, Clinton was corrupt in 1996. Therefore, she's corrupt in 2016, and that I am willfully, intentionally inconsistent with the methodology by not picking up Clinton's history in 1996. I brought that up because I wanted to make a point. By the time the information age is being discussed and the mode of warfare, through loads of evidence is being recognised that conspiracy theories are connected to that mode of warfare. Then I began to discuss David Bossy. In this history, he's set against the Clintons. He devoted his career to bringing down the Clinton family. And as I said, there's very few people that have a more thorough understanding of every Clinton scandal and conspiracy theory than David Bossy. He made a name for himself in that 1996 history and during Bill Clinton's presidency when he served as the chief investigator for the House committee that probed that Whitewater scandal. So he's the chief investigator for the Whitewater scandal, the investigation run by the House committee, and also other alleged Clinton misdeeds. In this history, David Bossy is investigating the Whitewater scandal. He's then fired because he himself is doctoring evidence. He's manipulating tapes to paint Hillary Clinton in an incorrect light. So he manipulates evidence to make Clinton appear guilty when the evidence does not say she is guilty, and because of that, he is fired from the investigative team. I then went to a Fox News. You can go and actually listen to that interview. He's being interviewed by Fox News. It's 2018. From 2009, he's developed a relationship with Donald Trump, and in 2018, he is being interviewed by Fox News. So he develops a relationship with Donald Trump in 2009. In 2016, he becomes involved deputy campaign manager for Donald Trump's campaign. And in 2018, on Fox News, he is being interviewed. And this is his host is Chris Wallace. And in that interview, David Bossy begins to say that there is a vast left-wing conspiracy against Donald Trump. And he says that vast left-wing conspiracy is very similar in words, in the way he wants to describe it, to how Hillary Clinton described this history when she said that there is a vast right-wing conspiracy against herself. And the right-wing media and the Republican Party have for all this time emphatically denied there was any right-wing Republican agenda against the Clintons in this history. Chris Wallace interjects and says to David Bossy, Hillary Clinton's claims of this vast right-wing conspiracy didn't turn out to be true. And Bossy interjects and says, yes, they did. He says, it was true, Chris, there was an effort by the conservative movement to undermine President Bill Clinton. This concept of Hillary Clinton and a right-wing conspiracy undermining her in 1996, this is just extra information that ties into our history of emotive warfare. There are conspiracy theories here and a right-wing agenda. There are conspiracy theories here and a right-wing agenda. This is connected to the evangelical churches. This is connected to the evangelical churches. You can trace that through Jerry Falwell. Why Elder Jeff wants to take this knot thread and begin it in 96 to 2016 and disconnect it from the previous studies I've already done, the core reason that he's had to construct it in this fashion is because he himself believes the conspiracy theories. And that is the underlying problem with his message and the problem they've had with this message from the very beginning. They believe the conspiracy theories against Hillary Clinton. Because of that, they've had to break all of our rules about how you construct reform lines and understand history. I just wanted to make that point to show how one element of what is currently being taught by FFA, by Elder Jeff, is incorrect. Conspiracy theories and manipulation by a right-wing agenda. Conspiracy theories and manipulation by a right-wing agenda, but I would never connect waymarks in this fashion. Instead, it just connects into the information war that we have already discussed and studied together. The only reason people would refute that is because they themselves believe the conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theories that are a test for our dispensation. We moved on from the information age and the mode of warfare, that 2016 election, and there's a great deal of information in there when we start considering battles. Then we went to study the internal and the external, 12, 13, 14, but you can overlay vast elements of this history and see the parallels between what is occurring externally and what is occurring internally. Then you have the history of the 10. This is where 2019 begins to open up. This leads into this study, where through an understanding of the 490, the 220, the 126, the 151, we come to a more and more firm understanding of 2019. Primarily the 126 and the 151 to begin, and then these other layers begin to be added. The 220 taking us to the French Revolution, the 490 to the Diet of Spires, etc. By this time it's around April, May 2018, and Elder Parminder attends a school in Australia. We have an opportunity to talk. Up to this point, I'm still considering 2019 to be PBM or Panium. It's not set in stone what this waymark is. There was one evening in Australia when Elder Parminder and I began to review this logic. That was a blessed evening of study. We took what had been done for 2019 with these other evidences, took it to the history of 2014, and this developed into the study of the midpoints. And together we recognized that 2014, when going back into history, took us to a midpoint. You understand the histories of 1863 and the American Civil War or the French Revolution, but there are others. And we saw that 2014, it is midnight, it is midway, it is a midpoint. You take that understanding into the history of the Millerites and you can understand why. Because 2014 is July, it is midway between April and October. When we begin to see this logic that 2014 connects to July 21 and this history of midway, we had to consider this, October 22 in the history of the Millerites. I had been becoming more and more uncomfortable with the idea that November 9, 2019 could be PBM. That was the waymark most in discussion in the movement, and the first date I considered it could be. In that study in that night, as we took an extra look at 2014, Elder Parminder asked me, "Do you really believe November 2019 is PBM?" I said, "No, it can't be." I asked him, "Do you believe it to be PBM?" And he said, "No." We both had come to the conclusion that 2019 was the close of probation. And we began to consider how this could be presented to the movement. It was decided that, out of respect, it should first be presented to Elder Jeff in Arkansas. 2014, the study of midpoints of midway or midnight. Once it was identified that 2014 was midway, it gave impetus to a study already in the working, and that of revolutions in history. I'd already looked at the French Revolution with Napoleon, and now there is another subject. Not just the French Revolution, now the American Civil War, takes you to 1865. Now the German Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the French Revolution. And it was observed that there's a repeating pattern through all those revolutions. Now the study of the revolutions, which perhaps more than any other study lends its weight to 2019 and November 9. And it's observed that all these revolutions take you to one point. November 9, 2019. That there is a revolution and then a counter-revolution. That this is November 2019, and now for the first time we already identify 2020 as the start of the counter-revolution. So this study develops, the study of the revolutions. There is a revolution. The revolution comes to an end November 9, 2019, or November 9, depending on the revolution. There's a period of preparation, and then the following year a counter-revolution. So we've placed 2020 in the record. Connected to this, I also begin to study the American Revolution and how that relates. It doesn't immediately connect into this study, but through a different logic, the American Revolution also connects. And with that study, it's observed that you can see 2019, but 2021, and Panium begins to open up. And other logic was brought to bear on that. That's the study of the revolutions. The American Revolution. From studying Fatima, 2017, November, I begin to study the counterfeit. Not just as it relates to 1917 and that history of Lucia, but also in a broader history, how the counterfeit has worked throughout history. And it isn't just 1 year, in 1 year, 1917, that Satan has been working to counterfeit. What we can see through the counterfeit is as the true begins in 1798, and as you have this alpha history preceded by a 1260, then you have 1850, 1863, various waymarks in this history, and then you have the 126 takes you to the Omega history. So now we have an alpha and omega history. A 1260 takes us to Millerite history. A 126 takes us to our own. So the counterfeit begins to open up, and that is understood. That just as God has led his people in this fashion, Satan has counterfeited it. It's all he knows how to do. And modern Israel has an Alpha and Omega history, therefore modern Babylon has an Alpha and Omega history. And all that understanding of Fatima and World War II is relating to their Alpha history. And these were paralleled in really quite a strong fashion. From 1798 connecting to 1899. 1818, 1917, 1833, 1933, 1844, 1945, 1850, November 1, 1950, November 1, 1863, 1862, 1886, 1987, 1888, 1989, and seeing how Satan has imperfectly but closely counterfeited the work of God. You have the true and you have the false. What you also have in this study is an understanding of failure and success. Because the history of World War II ends in 1945, which lines up with 1844, and 1945 was failure for the King of the North, failure for the Pope. So 1844 is failure and disappointment. Study of the counterfeits. All of this is laid into place, and then it comes to September 2018. It's my third visit to School of the Prophets in Arkansas. Not many people, it was not widely known that a message was about to be given. I was there a couple of weeks before I began to teach. In those few weeks, it was Elder Parminder taking the classes. One day I was sitting at a table in the dining room. It was breakfast or lunch, and there was a conversation going between Elder Parminder and a Brother Daniel from Brazil. Brother Daniel started asking some probing questions about what Elder Parminder was going to teach at that school, because Brother Daniel had a logic that he had developed where he saw, through his logic, that the prediction of the close of probation was about to be given. The prediction of Raphia. Brother Daniel recognized that we were entering into the midnight cry. That cry was about to be given, and he expected Elder Parminder to give that cry. And he had calculated that that cry would be given on October 13. So it's up to this point, the message has not yet been publicly taught. And then it's Brother Daniel, before I've begun teaching, that starts a discussion on October 13. Saying on October 13, he's expecting the prediction, or essentially our midnight cry. October 13 is a Sabbath. He was hoping that Elder Parminder was preaching at Lambert Fellowship that day, because it would add weight to his idea that that would be when the prediction would be given, on that Sabbath at Lambert Fellowship. He quickly realised that actually he had the sermon on that Sabbath, and he was quite disappointed. But this is before the message begins to be given. Really in September of 2018. I say this because October 13 later became a subject after I had left Arkansas, and I want it to be recognised that that was in place before the message was given. And then these messages are presented. Acts 27, through the Pyrrhic War, layer upon layer is added. All of these histories connecting to 2016, the election, mode of warfare, internal and external, all of which lead us into a study of time, and 2019, November 9. We go through this study, the midpoints, the revolutions, the American Revolution, and we finish by studying this concept of the counterfeit and failure and success. This study of the counterfeit closes that message given in Arkansas. I want us to note that it was October 3 that time was presented in Arkansas. The date of November 9. And this is in the United States. By October 13, I'd already left Arkansas. It's a Sabbath. And the Midnight Cry is presented in France. I think it was again Brother Daniel that gave that logic. 1 foot on the land, 1 foot on the sea. 1 foot in the glorious land, 1 foot in the new world, 1 foot in the old world. The Midnight Cry has been established on both land and sea. I remember when these studies were presented, Elder Jeff's reaction. I remember him saying, this message will test people to the uttermost how much they're willing to put their faith in reform lines. Will they put their faith in lines that people would fail or succeed in this test based on whether or not they can accept, completely place their faith in reform lines? A prophetic statement. Following this, I returned home to Australia, and it's December 2018. 2 other studies are presented. The first is a study on this. This is where Boston, Concord and Exeter are laid out. It's the repeating pattern. That this pattern repeats in every dispensation as a Boston, a Concord and an Exeter. Many people said, in the history of this, giving this message in Arkansas, you must be so happy that people are accepting. I knew that it was not that easy, that it wasn't truly accepted, because the real test lies beneath the date. The date is not the test. The 2520 and time setting was a test for a previous dispensation. The test related to whether or not we would accept or reject the message of conspiracy theories and equality. That message was already built into the message of October when it comes to the 2016 election specifically. That is why it is the history of Clinton that Elder Jeff is again attacking, because he failed then in that history in October at the giving of the Midnight Cry. He failed to reject his own conspiracy theories. And now as we see him return to them, the whole message begins to come under attack. After I left Arkansas, there's a camp meeting, and other elements start to come into the message and be tied into it, relating to the work of Theodore specifically. It's because of what I can see happening, how I can see the message beginning to be manipulated, that I actually do this study in the first place, relating to an increase of knowledge and formalization. I'm hoping that by presenting this study, people will actually recognize that God has led this message from 2016, that it is not something new that just sprung up in the last months of 2018, but this message itself is the increase of knowledge in 2016, because I can see in subtle ways the rejection of its elements. The repeating pattern is taught in Australia. After the repeating pattern, what is taught is the Battle of Heraclea. I won't illustrate it here because it really needs the lining up of histories in a more dot-pointed fashion. But it's the Battle of Heraclea that occurred, culminated December 19 of 2018, that's then presented in Australia. After these meetings, I travelled to Brazil. I'm teaching there with Elder Parminder, and these subjects begin to be delved into it more thoroughly, beginning with Acts 27, which actually takes up at least half of that school. People are already challenging the Midnight Cry message, and they're not attacking the date. They're not attacking the date because the date is not the test. What they're attacking, again, is 2016, Hillary Clinton, that election cycle. Where they're struggling is over conspiracy theories. They're struggling with conspiracy theories, and connected externally to this history, I can see there is an issue externally in the United States with regard to gender, sexism, and racism. And what people are tripping up over externally, they're also tripping up over internally. Our sexism can look a lot cleaner when you put it in a religious framework. When you see externally people attack Hillary Clinton because she's a woman, people in the movement might say that's wrong. The same people would say she shouldn't be president, she's female. It's the same issue. So there are these issues of gender and race that people are struggling with to accept that she should have been president in 2016. And they're also, to justify both of these, they're holding on to their conspiracy theories. And they're tripping over major key elements of this message. At that camp meeting in Brazil, because of this issue, I begin to study deeper into the Battle of Ipsus. And at that camp meeting, it's Ipsus that is emphatically laid out. And I know some, including Elder Jeff, would say that now I am making incorrect applications. The Battle of Ipsus gives its own application. I've never heard another application of the Battle of Ipsus that could sustain any weight. It gives its own application. And Ipsus is presented, and conspiracy theories are presented in a much more emphatic fashion. After Brazil, I become aware of a study that was done in the camp meeting in Arkansas by Elder Jeff relating to half right and half wrong. In that camp meeting in Arkansas, I think most of us listening would be familiar with it, where he teaches that the history in 2012, where Elder Parminder taught time, that Elder Parminder is half right and half wrong. Immediately I see that there's issues with that study. And in understanding why, I go back to this. Combining these histories of Alpha and Omega. You see it here, Macedonia, Italy, World War II, World War III, that there's failure, success, failure, success. But then when you bring it to the history of the counterfeit, it becomes much more personal. It goes from 1945 being a failure to the King of the North, whereas Panium is success. Now this isn't just two kingdoms fighting, now it's a counterfeit. Because 1945 is a failure for the King of the North, counterfeit King of the North. 1844 is failure and disappointment for the Millerite movement. So now it becomes personal. 1844 for their movement is failure and disappointment. Connecting to 1945. If we then line up 1945 with Panium, which is exactly what we do with the combination of these lines, then we know that this waymark is success. Alpha ends in failure. Omega ends in success. Alpha of the King of the North, 1945, ended in failure. Omega for the King of the North, Panium, ends in success. You have to switch the victor. The counterfeit makes it personal to this movement. I present that in Guadeloupe. And it's interesting, when this study is presented, regardless of what people feel in their hearts, whether or not they like my application of these lines, I wouldn't say my application because the lines give their own application. Whatever they have in their hearts regarding that teaching, they are silent. And they're not silent because I am intimidating. They are silent because the message is powerful and it explains itself. After Guadeloupe, the message continues to be taught through different countries over the course of this year. And other subjects begin to be investigated, particularly at first, this Civil War history. 1863 as a midpoint to 2014 and how it explains to us the history of 61 to 65. So key studies. After these subjects are laid out in Brazil, there is Guadeloupe. Half right, half wrong. This is done in Guadeloupe. And it's an understanding of failure, two histories, an alpha equals failure, and an omega equals success. Through the year, more and more study is done into this history of the Civil War. 61 to 65 explains 9/11 to 2019. And what begins to open up is the history of the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, and that conservative evangelical linked to Republican movement. And out of that those studies come the subject or study of In God We Trust. In God We Trust overlays through our prophetic timelines, time spans, the history of the Civil War, with a key portion of the Cold War to explain 9/11 to 2019. And we went backwards from 9/11 and traced its development. How it developed through the moral majority, the Christian right, and Jerry Falwell. Again, lining up Jerry Falwell, Reagan, Jerry Falwell Jr., Donald Trump. And that evangelical push. What is building through all of these studies from the very beginning is an understanding of equality, because already with 2016 and the Clinton election, it's being recognised that we have a problem within this movement, a problem understanding her position, who she is. So throughout much of this time, the subject being studied out is an understanding of equality, and that begins to be presented much more emphatically through Canada, and then beginning to be laid upon lines in France. And this study of equality shows us our history, a history of progression, of restoration, from New Earth to New Earth as it relates to racism. And then we see a progressive restoration from Eden to Eden as it relates to gender. That began to be laid out in France on a reform line, again in Zimbabwe. The study of equality. Also, what begins to be laid out, really particularly from Canada, is this understanding that we have of this midpoint waymark, this waymark here, and the sins of Babylon. Going back into Millerite history, and we will discuss this in more detail in a later presentation, but we're studying the sins of Babylon and that midway point. Which we term Sunday law, from our understanding of the great controversy. We began to study spiritual gifts and lay the concept of the Sunday law upon a reform line. All of this, particularly this line here, is laid out in its completed fashion in Germany. Everything that's been developing for 3 years all wraps up in a package to be presented in Germany. Up till a couple of weeks before Germany, not every element is understood, but it opens up just in time to be presented. And the last element that opens up is not a quality or a study of the Sunday law, but a study of World War I. In the history just prior to the German camp meeting. This is a history of the Fourth Diadochi War and World War II. This is a history of the Third Diadochi War and World War I, and how it relates to our reform line in World War III. This study fills in a major gap in our understanding of the relationship between the King of the North and the King of the South. Specifically, the relationship between Vladimir Putin, George Bush, and Obama. This is in a capsule form, each study, as it's developed through the last 3 years, beginning with Acts 27, going into the study of the King of the South, into a study of the counterfeit, information age. Every one of these elements is intimately intertwined with the other elements. I want us to consider where we are in our history. In the line of the priests, we're here. We're at the close of probation, 2019. The midnight cry opened up in October of 2018. And we've been on this journey to our close of probation. This is the history of the midnight cry. But 2019 is not just the close of probation. It's relevant in two ways for those faithful in this history. It is also the increase of knowledge for the 144,000 about the Sunday law. 9/11 to the Sunday law. One history such as this. 9/11 to the Sunday law. The two waymarks in this history, in this dispensation, that form the increase of knowledge and the formalisation are Raphia 2019 and Panium 2021. So 2019 is relevant in two separate and distinct ways for those who are faithful in this history. It is an increase of knowledge about the Sunday law. At the same time, it is a close of probation. This history of a repeating pattern, it doesn't just apply to our reform line, it applies to other reform lines such as the history of Christ. And I want to make the point that in every increase of knowledge and formalisation ever observed through those reform lines, it's the same message that's in development. It's not two different messages from two different people. It's the message of Elder Jeff in 1991, that increase of knowledge that forms the Time of the End magazine in 1996. And I know that he no longer agrees with this, but it's 2009 and Elder Parminder and this study of the 2520 that develops into Time 2012. If he doesn't agree with that, what reform line can he base that on? Because in every reform line, it's the same message and the same messenger. So when we come to understanding the Midnight Cry message in our history, in this history of 2016 to 2014 to 2019, 2016 is not Chowtu and Kimberley. The reason that becomes important is what he is now teaching, what Elder Jeff is now teaching, is that Chowtu and Kimberley in 2016 began with a good study that opened up the battles of Raphia and Panium. And he said Chowtu and Kimberley are a male and a female. They had a good study, but then it developed into Psalm 23 and they were wrong. And then he's saying 2018, there's two people there's me and Elder Parminder, and he says that they are correct, they have a good study, and then it develops into error. And he says that this is the increase of knowledge. Now, he also says in a presentation that he did not enter into this movement to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He didn't enter into this movement to take in a message that is a mixture of truth and error. So my question is this how God has worked in any other dispensation? 2016 is the increase of knowledge, but information, our prophetic understanding is increasing at every point, not just specifically this message. Other people are bringing truth into this. Chowtu and Kimberley brought great prophetic light into this movement, but that prophetic light is not the increase of knowledge on our reform line. The increase of knowledge is Acts 27 and the Pyrrhic War. So he has a couple of problems there. First of all, he cannot defend them being the increase of knowledge on any other reform line. Second problem, he would say they were right and then they were wrong. When he comes to this study, which part is right and which part is wrong? And where does it go wrong? He says he believes the lines. He doesn't agree with the application. And from everything I've seen so far, although he's continually having to backstep and deny more and more, from what I've seen so far, he accepts the history of World War II. He accepts World War II in its application. If he accepts World War II in its application, like a hand in a glove, you're forced to accept the history of World War I in its application. So if you accept World War II, that's the beginning of this message as it opens up. World War I is the very last element of this message that opens up. So we're right here and we're right here. So we're not right and then we're wrong. Now the entire history as an intermingled mess of truth and error. World War I was understood and taught after women's ordination, equality and Sunday law. Now he has a problem. And I don't know whether or not he's watched the presentations from Germany. I suspect not. But if he accepts these lines and says they're opened up by God, what excuse does he have to not accept World War I and say that it was opened up by God? And if God is opening up light here, at the very closing, final developments of the Midnight Cry message, why is he working with a false prophet? (2019) is the increase of knowledge, which explains why this message has continued to grow and develop in the history of 2019 past the Midnight Cry. It is also giving us more and more prophetic evidence, more and more characteristics that relate to the Sunday law crisis. I said in my first presentation that what they are playing is a game of Jenga. You have all of these blocks forming a tower and you're going to pull out block by block and then see when the tower finally disintegrates. That's what they're doing with this message. They're starting to pull out block by block. And what they are coming to, even if they don't realize it, is a rejection of the whole. Because as you take one part away, you're forced to deny another. As you take away your understanding of any part of this message, of half right and half wrong, you have to start taking apart the counterfeit. As you start taking apart your understanding of Donald Trump's role in this history, you have to start taking apart the internal and external. As you take apart 2012 and its significance, you have to take apart the message of time setting and the work of Elder Parminder in that history. Every element that they're taking apart impacts every other element. It's like a woven garment. You cannot take away a thread without it beginning to disintegrate as a whole. Chowtu and Kimberley were truth then error. Elder Jeff has recognised that himself, and that's the model he's now accusing the Midnight Cry message of following. But since when did truth become error in this message, and at what point does he want to say that? Specifically when you find World War I opening up as the final closing piece. What I find remarkable is that this is not an attack upon me, this is an attack upon God. Because what he's having to say, really, I find, if I was to say it, if I was to repeat his sentiments, I would find them egotistical for myself. Because what he is saying is that somehow large elements of this work, of these lines, are the work of Sister Tess. He's saying that I have created these. I find that actually quite brilliant. The concept that I would be able to develop these lines and these studies. But that is what he's being forced to say. If he acknowledges that some has been opened up by God, then he says the rest is my own work and it's a mixture of truth and error. But they are not able to identify what is truth and what is error. You know they can't identify what is truth and what is error because they've had to erase the whole of it from their YouTube channels. Why would they have to erase the whole of it? Because they themselves do not know how to safely separate the truth from the error. So they have been forced to erase the entirety of the Midnight Cry message, elements of which Elder Jeff himself is forced to admit are great light. Because they attempt to claim to accept part of it, they are having to erase all, and they will become established in a position where they erase all. Elder Jeff has said that I'm inconsistent in my methodology. I would like to see where I have been inconsistent, because any example he has given has not stood up to closer scrutiny. I want to quote from Inspiration, from Selected Messages, Second Selected Messages 80.4. I'm going to quote through this history and make an application as I read. Ellen White is in a conversation with a brother. She's been dialoguing with him for some time, and in this dialogue she says this to him. She's had a meeting with him previously, and she's referring to that meeting now as she writes to him. She says, several times during our conversation, our meeting, in which you became very much in earnest, you repeated the sentence, O consistency, thou art a jewel. That is what Elder Jeff is attacking this message with. Myself, I prefer to say the message, that I am not consistent in my methodology. And he says in his Arkansas presentations, the same concept, O consistency, thou art a jewel. I repeat the same with decided force to you, Elder Jeff. You claim to believe the testimonies, the lines, and he has. Let the lines set you right on this point. The Lord has shown me clearly that the image of the beast will be formed before probation closes, for it is to be the great test for the people of God by which their eternal destiny will be decided. What is Ellen White and this gentleman arguing over? They're arguing over the history between the Sunday law and the close of probation and what that looks like. They're arguing over this history, the Sunday law history, 2014 to 2019 history. This man claims to believe the testimonies, the lines. The lines give their own prophetic interpretation, their own application. Continuing to read. You have taken the history of the disobedient prophet. So you've gone to a history, you've taken a story out of context, as given in the Old Testament. You've taken a history of the disobedient prophet, or Baal Peor, or Wartburg, or any other history, and applied it to Sister White. You say she is perfectly honest, but a deceived prophet. For this reason, The testimonies of the Spirit of God, the midnight cry message, can have no effect on you. Has the Lord opened to you or your daughter, Bronwyn, your wife, Kathy, or your children, Bronwyn and Clayton, the disobedience of Sister White? If she has walked contrary to God, will you show in what? My duty is to make plain statements of my position, for you misinterpret my testimony. You misinterpret the lines God has opened up. You wrench them from their true meaning and ring in my name whenever you think it will enforce whatever you have to say. But when the testimonies, the lines, do not harmonize with your theories, do not harmonize with your application, I am excused because I am the false prophet. There are many ways of evading the truth. Your position is a jumble of inconsistencies. I want us to see the accusation being made. The claim is that they accept the testimonies, they accept what God has opened up, but only as it relates to their application. If it doesn't coincide with their application, their excuse is, yes, God has opened up a certain amount of light to this individual. But this individual, while taking in some elements of God's light, is also using Old Testament Bible stories out of context, a false prophet. And because she's a false prophet, they're able to evade the truth already clearly laid out by the reform lines. The position, the arguments being currently levelled against the movement and the midnight cry message are a jumble of inconsistencies. Elder Jeff has said in his presentations that we have denied the Bible and the writings of Ellen White. I want us to consider this for one moment. For that purpose, I'm going to erase this portion of the board. Elder Jeff has claimed that Elder Parminder and myself reject the authority of the Bible and the writings of Ellen White. Then I want us to consider not just a reform line, because you can see it in the reform line itself, but also in her writings. He made an accusation in one of his presentations that he had concerns with the Midnight Cry message in October when it was first given, but that his concerns were, quote, squelched. He has said that the work of Theodore in this history was squelched, and that studies from other brethren, particularly coming out of Africa, were squelched. He says now that the Midnight Cry message is intermingled with fanaticism, and that it is his work to come out of hiding and put an end to that fanaticism. And again, he misuses history to justify that point, which I can deal with in another presentation. Then let's consider the Midnight Cry message as it is in Millerite history. April 19 is a disappointment. Fanaticism enters the movement. I'm going to quote from Great Controversy 398.2. It was not the proclamation of the Second Advent that caused fanaticism and division. That is a clear sentence of inspiration. It was not the proclamation of November 9 that caused fanaticism and division. It was not linked to the Midnight Cry message in any fashion. This fanaticism appeared in the summer of 1844, after their disappointment, where Adventists were in a state of doubt and perplexity concerning their real position. The preaching of the first angel's message and of the midnight cry tended directly to repress fanaticism and dissension. Fanaticism enters the movement April 19. July 21, it begins to swell, but fanaticism is still there. August 1, Concord. And then you come to August 15, Exeter, which lines up with October of 2018. "9/11, fanaticism. Enters the movement. 2014, a message begins to rise that will deal with this fanaticism. 2016, Concord. 2018, Exeter, the Midnight Cry. It was not the proclamation of the Second Advent and the Midnight Cry that caused this fanaticism and this split, this division. That began at 9/11. The preaching of this message had the opposite effect. It repressed fanaticism and dissension. Those who participated in these solemn movements were in harmony. Their hearts were filled with love for one another and for Jesus, whom they expected soon to see. The one faith, the one blessed hope, lifted them above the control of any human influence and proved a shield against the assaults of Satan. So you have in this history a message coming that does not bring with it fanaticism, but instead represses fanaticism. August 15 at Exeter, there's 2 camps. 2 tents, you could say. There's a tent corresponding to the Midnight Cry, and there's a tent corresponding to fanaticism. And it's the Midnight Cry that squelches the fanaticism. What Elder Jeff is saying is that the Midnight Cry with it brought the fanaticism, and that they all coexist, intermingled in the one tent. I would suggest an application of that history that agrees with line upon line and Spirit of Prophecy quotes. In October 2018, there are 2 camps. One is the Midnight Cry, and then there is another tent working subtly against that message. You have the work of Theodore, his fanaticism, his time setting, repeatedly proven to fail. There were 2 tents when the Midnight Cry was given at Exeter. There were 2 tents when the Midnight Cry was given in 2018. The fact that Elder Jeff himself identifies that Theodore, that the certain studies coming out of Africa, and that his own voice was silenced when this message was given is in itself testimony to the fact that there was fanaticism silenced by the Midnight Cry message. It is not that I'm intimidating that they are silenced, or that Elder Parminder is intimidating. It is the fact that the message and lions themselves carry with themselves an amount of power that silences dissenting movements. All of this takes us back full circle to Acts 27. I'm not sure what lions people still claim to believe in. Whether or not they still claim to believe in Acts 27, I suggest that until they realise the implications of it, they will still continue to believe in it. I want to make 2 more applications and then we will close. Acts 27, this first line, the line of Adramyttium. I'll place it in here. Adramyttium, just from 9/11. The refreshing, the Midnight Cry, and then Sunday Law was the shut door. Midnight Cry. This was in Acts 27. In those first few verses, their journey. For space, I haven't gone back to 1989 and Caesarea. They leave from Caesarea. They sail under Cyprus, the Sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, and come to Myra. Leave from Caesarea and then Sidon at 9/11, and then Cyprus. And from the very beginning, with all its import, it is taught that the midnight cry at Cyprus, from the very beginning of the opening up of this message, it's identifying that there is a true and a false prophet. There is a false prophet externally, and there is a false prophet internally. And you know, if there is a false prophet, there's a true prophet. There's the midnight cry. It's Samuel Snow. There is a true message. But rallying against the true message, there is a false prophet already identified at the midnight cry, externally by Elymas, internally by Simon Magus. And we can see that from the line of the Millerites brought into our own, there are two tents. There is a true prophet and there is a false prophet. True message, false message. The true message silences the false message. The message of the midnight cry in that tent silenced Watertown. It silenced the fanaticism. As Elder Jeff himself said, people were squelched or silenced when the midnight cry message was given. That is the characteristic of the midnight cry, because the false prophet, the fanaticism that has been pervading this movement has come through the work of Theodore. And what Elder Jeff is now sharing. You can see that line upon line and Spirit of Prophecy quotes defend our position. I want to close with a word of encouragement to those people who have accepted the leading of God as these truths have been opened up. We are in the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law. God is pouring out rain upon us. We are in just prior to the close of probation for the priests, just prior to the cross. We have demonstrated in prior studies that we are in the judgment hall. And I want to remind us of the words of Jesus when his role is attacked, and I'm saying throughout this study, he represents the movement. Every ear was bent to listen, and every eye was fixed on his face as he answered, "Thou hast said, you've already said who I am." A heavenly light seemed to illuminate his pale countenance as he added, "Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." When do we as priests, as well as those accusing us, see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven? It's at the second advent. And when is our second advent? Panium. However dark the judgment hall, Gethsemane, the cross, however dark that all looks, Jesus is able to give the promise that whatever side you stand on, at Panium, you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power. That his work will be successful. I want this study to not just be hopefully some evidence for those wavering, that they can see that this has not been the work of humanity. There is no human being that could open up these lines, nor their application. I hope that helps people who are wavering, but I also hope that it helps or encourages those who have stayed true to this message, that God has led all of this time in this journey, and even though we can prophetically identify we are in the darkest point of our reform line, Jesus even then gives the promise, you will see Panium, and at Panium you will come on the right hand of power, this movement fulfilling its function, Pentecost, taking the gospel to the second group, fulfilling the mission God appointed to them from the time of the end. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, I thank you for how you have led. We know that throughout all of this time, these about approximately 3 years, Lord, of study, that it has been you who opened up every truth and every application, that human hands have not mingled truth and error with the midnight cry message. I pray that people will revisit these subjects, that they will see the prophetic evidence for these lines, that we are not misusing prophecy, but we are We are using rules, the methodology that you have given us to understand where we are in Earth's history, not just externally, Lord, but internally as a movement. I pray, Lord, that people will be encouraged, that they do stand for the truth, that God has led them to accept this message, and whatever the implications, you continue to lead us and guide us. I pray, Lord, that you'll grant us humility and wisdom and courage and faith as never before. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.